You won't believe what happens when a single mother gets pulled over by a police officer on a quiet street. What starts as a routine traffic stop quickly turns into something far more unexpected. Her heart races, her kids are in the back seat, and every second feels like an eternity. But what happens next will leave you speechless. Stay tuned until the end to witness a moment that could change everything. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this one. Sergeant James Raymond leaned back in the driver's seat of his patrol car, glancing at the orange glow of the setting sun. Another long shift was coming to an end, and he felt the weight of the day settling on his shoulders. The streets had been quiet, almost uneventful, and James found himself reflecting on his life. His partner was out sick, leaving him to patrol alone. The solitude gave him time to think, though he wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. The day had been routine. James had cruised through the familiar neighborhoods, waved at a few shop owners, and helped an elderly woman cross a busy intersection. He had even broken up a group of teenagers loitering outside a convenience store, though they left without much protest. As the hours dragged on, he began to fantasize about the hot cup of coffee and the latest episode of his favorite show waiting for him at home. Just a little longer, he thought. His thoughts were interrupted when a car sped through the intersection ahead, running a red light. The vehicle, an older model sedan, caught his attention immediately. The driver hadn't even slowed down. James sighed, turned on his sirens, and began pursuit. As he closed the distance, he noted the car's license plate and its slightly battered exterior. The driver didn't pull over, instead continuing down the road, weaving slightly between lanes. James's pulse quickened. After following for several blocks, the car finally pulled over near the curb of a busy street. James parked behind it and stepped out, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. As he approached the driver's side window, he saw a young black woman behind the wheel. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and her eyes darted nervously to the rearview mirror. On the back seat, 3 small children squirmed and fidgeted, their chatter silenced by the tension in the air. James knocked on the window, and the woman hesitated before rolling it down just enough for him to speak. "Good evening, ma'am. Can I see your license and registration?" he asked, keeping his tone calm but firm. The woman nodded quickly, her movements jerky, and began rummaging through her purse. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to run the light. I wasn't paying attention. My kids were—" She stopped herself, glancing back at the children. Her voice trembled, and James could see the stress etched into her face. "Ma'am, I understand," he replied, his eyes softening. "But running a red light is dangerous. You could have caused an accident." He glanced into the back seat again, noting the absence of car seats. "Are these your kids?" "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I should have car seats, but—" Her voice trailed off, and she bit her lip as if holding back tears. James straightened. "Do you realize how unsafe that is?" he asked, though his tone lacked the reprimand it might usually carry. "If something happened—" "I know," she interrupted, her voice breaking. "I know, okay? I'm doing my best. I'm working 2 jobs, and I can't afford them right now. I can barely afford rent." She inhaled sharply, her hands shaking as she handed over her license. "I didn't mean to run the light. I'm just so tired." James took the license, glancing at her name. Monica Johnson. He looked back at the children, who were now watching him with wide, curious eyes. Something in her voice struck a chord. He thought of his own children and how hard he had fought to give them a stable life after his divorce. He thought of the nights he had spent working overtime, missing their milestones just to make ends meet. He sighed, stepping back toward his patrol car to run her information. Monica's story played over in his mind. She wasn't lying. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the desperation in her voice. When he returned to her window, she was wiping away a tear, trying to compose herself for her children's sake. "Miss Johnson," he began, his voice softer now, "I understand you're going through a tough time, but driving without car seats is incredibly dangerous, especially for kids that small." Monica nodded silently, her gaze fixed on her hands. "I know," she whispered. I don't have any other choice right now." James hesitated. His training told him to issue a ticket. It was protocol, but his instincts told him there was more to this situation than just a traffic violation. He thought about what he could do to actually help her, to make sure those kids were safe. After a long pause, he spoke again. "I'm not going to give you a ticket," he said, and her head snapped up in surprise. "But I need to make sure those kids are safe." "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. James pulled out his phone and stepped away from the car, making a call. Monica watched him, her confusion evident. After a few minutes, he returned. "I've arranged for car seats to be delivered to your home," he said simply. "They'll be there tomorrow. It's already taken care of." Monica stared at him, her mouth opening and closing as she tried to find the words. I don't know what to say. Thank you. Thank you so much. Just make sure you use them," James said, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "And please, drive carefully. Those kids are counting on you." Monica nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "I will. I promise." James handed back her license and stepped back as she started the car. As he watched her drive away, he felt a sense of relief. He knew he had done the right thing. Those kids would be safer, and Monica would have one less burden to carry. As he climbed back into his patrol car, the sun had almost disappeared below the horizon. He felt tired, but for the first time in a while, it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that weighed him down. It was the kind that came from knowing you had made a difference, even if just for one person. Monica Johnson sat on the edge of her worn-out couch, her phone clutched tightly in her hands. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she debated whether to share her story online. Her children were finally asleep in the next room, their soft snores barely audible through the paper-thin walls of their small apartment. Her eyes flicked to the empty space in the corner where, by tomorrow, 3 brand-new car seats would be delivered. Her heart swelled with gratitude and disbelief. Her fingers moved across the screen as she typed. "Today, something incredible happened," she wrote. "I was pulled over by a police officer, and I thought it would be like every other time. Stress, fear, maybe even a ticket I couldn't afford. But this officer, he did something I never expected." She paused, letting her fingers rest on the screen as her thoughts caught up with her emotions. The weight of everything she'd been through, the endless shifts at the diner, the sleepless nights worrying about her kids, the guilt of not being able to give them more. All of it felt like it was spilling onto the screen with each word she typed. Her hands trembled as she continued. "Instead of giving me a ticket, he listened to me, he heard me, and then he went out of his way to help me. He bought car seats for my kids, 3 of them, out of his own pocket." She stopped, staring at the words, unsure if anyone would believe her. But it was the truth, and the world deserved to know. People like him remind me that there's still good in this world. I just wanted to share that with you all. Monica clicked post and set the phone down, not expecting much. Her story was just one of a million others shared on social media daily. She assumed it would go unnoticed. She had no idea that within hours her story would spread like wildfire. The next morning, Monica woke up to the buzz of her phone. Still half asleep, she reached for it, squinting at the screen. Her eyes widened as she saw hundreds of notifications, comments, likes, and shares flooding her post. Messages from strangers filled her inbox. "Your story brought tears to my eyes. People like that officer are rare. I'm so glad you shared this." Faith in humanity restored. Her eyes darted from one comment to another, overwhelmed by the flood of support. The post had thousands of likes, and it was still climbing. She couldn't believe it. Her heart raced as she sat up, her mind barely able to process it all. Strangers from all over the country were reaching out to her, sending her words of encouragement. Her oldest son, Tyler, wandered into the room rubbing his eyes. "Mama, why you up so early?" he asked, his little face scrunched in confusion. "Just looking at something, baby," Monica replied, pulling him onto her lap. She kissed the top of his head and hugged him tightly. "Go get your brother and sister. We're having breakfast together today." Meanwhile, Sergeant James Raymond was oblivious to the storm brewing online. His shift had ended late the night before, and he'd finally managed to get a full night's sleep. When he woke up, the first thing he did was check his phone, as usual. What he saw next caught him completely off guard. His face was on the screen. "What the?" he muttered, sitting up on the edge of his bed. There, in front of him, was a video clip of him talking to Monica at the side of the road. He had no idea someone had filmed it from across the street. The caption read, "This is what it means to protect and serve." James rubbed his face, groaning as his phone started vibrating with notifications. Texts from his co-workers, calls from unknown numbers, and dozens of social media tags flooded his phone. A text from his captain caught his attention. "Captain Lopez. Raymond, call me ASAP. We need to talk about this video." He sat in silence for a moment, his eyes fixed on the screen. He tapped the video, letting it play. It was short, maybe 30 seconds, but it captured everything. Him walking up to Monica's car, talking to her, then making the call to the store. The person filming had even zoomed in on his face when he handed Monica back her license with a small, reassuring smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to go viral. James sighed heavily, already feeling the weight of it all. He knew how this would play out. He'd seen it happen to other officers. One moment of kindness and suddenly you're a hero, a symbol of hope people latch on to. It wasn't why he did it. He didn't want the spotlight. He did it because it was the right thing to do. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from his ex-wife, Camille. "Camille, the kids saw your video. They're proud of you, James. Just thought you should know." That one hit harder than he expected. His kids had seen it. They'd seen him do something good. For once, they wouldn't just think of him as the tired, overworked dad who missed their school events. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. Later that day, while on his shift, Captain Lopez called him into his office. Lopez was a big man with a no-nonsense attitude, but today he wore a rare smile. "Have a seat, Raymond," Lopez said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. James sat down, unsure of where this was going. "Look," Lopez began, folding his hands in front of him. "That video, it's everywhere. We're talking news outlets calling for interviews, reporters asking to speak to you. I'm just letting you know, it's about to get a little chaotic." "Captain, I didn't do it for attention," James said quickly, leaning forward in his chair. "I did it because it was the right thing to do. That woman. I know, James, Lopez interrupted, his eyes kind. I know you didn't do it for attention. That's exactly why this is blowing up. People see that. They see you weren't performing for the camera. He leaned back, a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth. You know, I've been in this job a long time. Seen a lot of officers try to go viral with their acts of kindness. This wasn't that, and people can tell. James sat there, hands on his knees, unsure of what to say. News stations want you for interviews, Lopez continued, but I'll leave that up to you. If you want to do it, I'll support you. If you don't, I'll have the department's media team handle it. I'm not interested, James replied firmly. I just want to do my job, Captain. Good, Lopez said, nodding. But just so you know, people are going to remember this one, James. They're going to remember you. That night, James drove home in silence, the weight of everything sitting on his chest. His thoughts drifted to Monica and her kids. He wondered if they'd gotten the car seats yet. He hoped she'd be okay. She reminded him too much of people he'd grown up with. People who worked harder than anyone but still struggled to get ahead. When he pulled into his driveway, he saw two little figures bouncing up and down in the front window. His kids. A smile crept onto his face. He barely had time to turn off the engine before the front door burst open, and his son Jaden ran toward him at full speed, arms wide open. "Daddy!" Jaden shouted, launching himself into James's arms. His daughter Layla followed, hugging his leg tightly. "Did you see me on TV, Daddy?" Jaden asked, his eyes wide with excitement. "Yeah, I saw it," James replied, ruffling his son's hair. "You proud of me, big guy?" "Uh-huh," Jaden grinned. "You're famous now." James laughed softly, his heart feeling lighter than it had in weeks. He glanced toward the front porch and saw Camille standing there, arms crossed, a small smile on her face. She nodded at him, just a simple nod, but it was enough. Later that night, as he sat on the couch with his kids leaning against him, he scrolled through his phone. He saw Monica's post again. Thousands of comments, thousands of strangers talking about him, calling him a hero, but he didn't feel like one. He looked at his kids curled up next to him. If they could see him as a hero, maybe that was enough. James put his phone down, wrapped his arms around his children, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would be another long day, but for tonight, he was exactly where he needed to be. The sun filtered softly through the thin curtains of Monica Johnson's small apartment. The distant hum of traffic blended with the faint chirping of birds outside. Monica sat at the small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee. Her phone lay face up in front of her, vibrating every few seconds with notifications. She barely glanced at it anymore. The night before, it had been impossible to look away, watching in awe as her post exploded with likes, shares, and heartwarming comments from complete strangers. She scrolled through some of them now, her eyes skimming the messages of encouragement. "Restores my faith in humanity. This officer deserves an award. Someone give that man a medal." Her fingers hovered over a message from a woman named Lisa. It read, "I'm a single mom, too. I know how hard it is to ask for help. Your story gave me hope." Monica's eyes welled with tears, and she blinked rapidly, willing herself not to cry in front of the kids. She glanced towards the living room where her 3 children sat on the floor watching cartoons. Tyler, her oldest, was busy stacking blocks, while his younger brother and sister giggled at the cartoon characters on screen. Her eyes darted to the corner of the room where 3 sleek, brand-new car seats sat in a row, still in their packaging. She couldn't believe it. They'd arrived early that morning, just like Sergeant Raymond had promised. Her fingers ran over the smooth plastic of one of the boxes. It felt unreal, like a dream she was afraid to wake up from. "Mama, when are we going to use them?" Tyler asked, looking up from his blocks. "Soon, baby," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "Real soon." She picked up her phone again, scrolling past more notifications. Then she saw something unexpected, a message from a local news station. Her breath caught in her throat. They wanted to interview her. The message read, "Hi Monica, this is Jessica Lee from Channel 9 News. We saw your story and think it's incredible. We'd love to feature you and Officer Raymond on our morning broadcast. Please let us know if you're available." Monica stared at it, unsure what to do. Her first instinct was to say no. The idea of being on TV made her anxious, but then she thought about what it could mean for other mothers like her. If people heard her story, maybe they'd see that help could come from the most unexpected places. Maybe it could inspire someone. Before she could decide, there was a knock on the door. Her heart jumped. She wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping her hands on her jeans, she approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. Two men stood on the other side, both holding cameras. One of them raised a hand and waved. "Monica Johnson, Channel 9 News," one of them said, loud enough for her to hear. Her heart sank. They'd come to her home. She glanced back at her kids, who were still fixated on the TV. For a moment, she thought about not answering, but her feet moved on their own. She unlocked the door and opened it slowly, just wide enough to see them. "Ma'am, sorry for showing up unannounced," the reporter said, offering a kind smile. "We just wanted to see if you'd be willing to speak with us. Your story is all over the news and people are calling Officer Raymond a hero." Monica hesitated, her eyes darting between the two men. "I don't know," she said quietly, biting her lip. "I've got my kids inside, and I don't really want them on camera." "Completely understandable," the reporter said, lowering his voice. "We can keep the kids out of it. We just want to hear your side of the story in your own words. It's a beautiful message, and I think people would love to hear it from you." She glanced back at her kids again. They hadn't even noticed the men at the door. Tyler was still stacking his blocks, and her youngest was laughing at the TV. She exhaled slowly. "Okay," she finally said, opening the door a little wider, "but let's do it quick." The men moved with precision, setting up their equipment as Monica sat on the couch. Her heart pounded in her chest as they placed a small microphone on her shirt and positioned a camera in front of her. She felt like she was being put on display, but she reminded herself that this was bigger than her. This was about showing people that help could come when you least expect it. "All right, Monica," the reporter said, sitting across from her with a notepad in hand. "Just be yourself. We're going to ask you a few simple questions, and you can answer however you feel comfortable." Monica nodded, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. "Can you tell us what happened that day?" he asked. From the beginning. Monica took a deep breath, then started talking. Her voice shook at first, but as she spoke, it grew stronger. She talked about how exhausted she'd been, how she was just trying to get her kids home after a long shift at work. She described the moment she saw the police lights behind her and how fear had gripped her. "I thought, here we go again," she admitted. "But it wasn't like that. This officer, he was different." Tears welled in her eyes as she talked about Sergeant Raymond, how he'd listened to her, how he'd seen her struggle and chose compassion over punishment. He didn't just see me as some woman breaking the law, she said, wiping her eyes. He saw a mother doing her best. The cameraman gave her a soft nod of encouragement. And the car seats? He prompted. Monica smiled, glancing at the 3 seats still in their packaging. He bought them himself, she said, her voice cracking. He didn't have to do that, but he did. The reporter leaned forward. What would you say to him now, if he were watching this? Her breath caught in her throat, and she swallowed hard. I'd say thank you, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Not just for the car seats, but for seeing me. For seeing me as a person, not just another problem. That's rare these days. The cameraman gave her a thumbs up and the reporter smiled warmly. That was beautiful, Monica. Thank you for sharing your story with us. Once they left, Monica sat on the couch, feeling like she'd just run a marathon. Her kids ran up to her and she pulled them into a hug, holding them tight. That evening, as she scrolled through her phone, she saw her face on the Channel 9 news page. The clip of her interview had been posted online. She tapped it, watching herself on screen, and felt a strange mixture of pride and vulnerability. The comments poured in again. Her story brought me to tears. That officer deserves a raise. Faith in humanity restored once again. Meanwhile, at the police precinct, Sergeant James Raymond was finishing up his shift. He had no idea about the news broadcast until one of his fellow officers called out, "Hey, Raymond, you're on TV, man." He looked up at the small television in the break room, and there he was, standing next to Monica's car, handing her back her license. Then it cut to Monica, her eyes full of tears, thanking him on camera. The room went quiet. Officers around him exchanged glances. "Didn't think you had it in you, Raymond," one officer teased, giving him a playful nudge. James rolled his eyes, but deep down, something about it felt good. It wasn't about the attention. It was about knowing that, in that moment, he'd made the right call. His phone buzzed, and it was another message from his ex-wife. "Camille, kids saw the news. They're calling you a superhero. Thought you should know." James let out a soft laugh, closing his eyes for a moment. He could see Jaden and Layla's faces in his mind, full of pride. If that was the only reward he got from all this, it was more than enough. Later that night, after his kids had gone to sleep, James sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through the hundreds of comments on Monica's post. People called him a hero, a role model, a man who did what others wouldn't. He didn't think of himself that way, but as he glanced toward his kid's bedroom door, he realized it didn't matter. If his children saw him that way, then maybe, just maybe, he'd done something right. He placed his phone on the nightstand and lay back on the bed, closing his eyes. It had been a long day. Tomorrow would be just as long. But tonight, he could rest knowing that, for one family, he had made a difference. And sometimes that was enough, and that's how one unexpected moment changed everything. Life can take unpredictable turns, but sometimes it's those moments that restore our faith in humanity. If this story moved you, make sure to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. We want to hear from you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another powerful story like this one. See you in the next video.